There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a battlefield once the guns finally stop. A silence that soldiers on the losing side often described in their private writings with far more honesty than any official report ever allowed. In the last days of October and the first days of November 1942, in the sand and scrub of the Egyptian desert near a small railway halt called El Alamein, a great many German soldiers sat down in whatever shelter they could find, pencil stubs in hand, and tried to make sense of what had just happened to them. What survives from those pages, scattered across regimental archives, private family collections, and post-war historical research, paints a picture that is far more revealing than any triumphant newsreel of the time ever admitted. These were men who had marched across North Africa feeling almost unstoppable, and who now found themselves describing, in cramped handwriting by torchlight, an enemy that had somehow outthought them, out-organized them, and eventually simply overwhelmed them. To understand the shock in those diary pages, it helps to remember the mood only a few months earlier. German and Italian forces under Rommel had pushed the British back with startling speed through Cyrenaica and into Egypt itself, and there was a genuine sense among many rank-and-file soldiers that the road to Cairo, and perhaps to the entire Suez Canal, lay open ahead of them. Letters home from the summer of 1942 are full of a certain swagger, references to the Desert Fox and his seemingly magical ability to outmaneuver the British time and again. One infantryman, writing to his mother in July, described the British as brave but confused, forever retreating just as his own unit closed in for the kill. That confidence did not disappear overnight, but by the final week of October something had clearly begun to shift, and the tone in the surviving pages changes almost paragraph by paragraph as the battle wears on. The first thing that seems to have genuinely unsettled German soldiers was not the strength of the British attack itself, but its sheer, deliberate patience. For weeks before the main assault, British engineers and infantry had been probing, testing, and mapping the vast belts of German and Italian minefields that Rommel's forces had laid across the front, fields so dense and so carefully sown that German troops themselves had taken to calling them the Devil's Gardens. A number of diary entries from this period describe nights of constant, low-level harassment, small raiding parties, artillery registration shots, patrols crawling forward in the dark to lift a mine or cut a wire, then withdrawing before dawn. To German soldiers used to a war of rapid maneuver and sudden shock, this slow, methodical preparation felt almost eerie. One artillery observer wrote that the British seemed to be studying them the way a surveyor studies a piece of ground before building on it, and that the waiting itself had become its own kind of psychological pressure, gnawing away at men who would have preferred a sudden battle to this creeping, patient certainty that something enormous was coming. Then, in the early hours of the 23rd of October, it came. Survivors described the opening barrage of Operation Lightfoot in terms that read almost like descriptions of a natural disaster rather than a military action. Nearly 1,000 guns opened fire at once along the front, a wall of noise and flame that many soldiers said they felt in their chests before they consciously understood what was happening. One German soldier, sheltering in a shallow trench that suddenly felt laughably inadequate, wrote that the ground itself seemed to be trying to shake him out of it, that the noise had no gaps in it at all, simply one continuous roar that made it impossible to hear the man shouting orders barely a meter away. Another described watching the horizon turn a strange orange color that never seemed to fade, as though the sun itself had decided to rise several hours early and had chosen to do so violently. For men who had grown used to thinking of themselves as the aggressors in this desert war, the sheer scale and coordination of that opening bombardment was, by their own written accounts, deeply disorientating. What comes through again and again in these pages is not simply fear of the shelling itself, though there was plenty of that, but a dawning realization that the British artillery was not firing blindly. Forward observers, deeply enmeshed in that same networked style of coordination that had proven so effective earlier in the Desert War, were calling in fire onto specific, carefully identified positions almost as soon as movement was spotted. A German officer commanding a forward machine gun post wrote with something close to reluctant admiration that every time his men attempted to shift position, even under cover of darkness, shells seemed to find them again within minutes, as though someone somewhere had been watching the whole time and simply waiting for them to move. It is a small but telling detail because it suggests that what really broke German confidence in these opening days was not raw firepower alone, but the uncomfortable sense of being seen and tracked by an enemy who seemed to know exactly where they were and where they were going next. The minefields themselves feature heavily in these accounts, and not always in the way one might expect. Several diarists describe the strange, nervous tension of manning a defensive line built around fields that both sides now knew intimately, fields that German engineers had laid with real skill and no small amount of pride, only to watch British sappers methodically clearing lanes through them under fire, night after night, at considerable cost, but with grinding, unstoppable determination. One German engineer officer, whose job it had been to help design parts of those very defences, wrote with a kind of bitter professional respect that the British seemed willing to accept losses that any sensible commander would try to avoid, simply because they had calculated, correctly as it turned out, that persistence would eventually open the gaps they needed. There is an odd thread running through many of these entries, a soldier's professional appreciation for the enemy's competence sitting uneasily alongside personal terror and growing despair, two emotions that do not usually appear together, but which the desert seemed to force into the same sentence. As the battle ground on through the final week of October and into November, exhaustion begins to dominate the writing far more than tactical analysis. Diaries from this period are often shorter, more fragmented, sometimes barely legible, written by men who had not slept properly in days. A young signals operator recorded that he could no longer remember which day of the week it was, only that the artillery never seemed to fully stop, that even in the brief lulls his ears kept ringing with a noise that was not actually there. Several entries mention the Khamsin, the fierce desert wind that whipped up choking clouds of fine sand, turning an already miserable battlefield into something closer to a blind struggle where men fired at muzzle flashes because they could see nothing else. One soldier described crawling on his hands and knees between positions because standing upright in the wind and dust made him a silhouette against a British flare, an admission of just how exposed and vulnerable the German line had become despite months of careful preparation. What stands out most in reading these accounts collectively is how often German soldiers wrote about coordination, or rather, the increasingly obvious lack of it on their own side, compared with what they were experiencing from the British. Fuel shortages meant that armoured units meant to counterattack and plug gaps in the line often could not reach them in time, sometimes arriving hours after a crisis had already been decided one way or another. A Panzer crewman recorded with evident frustration that his unit had received orders to move to support an infantry position under heavy pressure, only to be told an hour later that there was not enough petrol to make the journey and that they would have to wait for a resupply convoy that itself was under constant harassment from the air. Contrast this with the picture that emerges, even second-hand, of how British forces on the other side of the line seemed able to summon artillery, reinforcements and air support with what felt to German observers like unsettling speed. It was not that German equipment or German soldiers were inferior man for man, and several diarists explicitly say as much, praising the individual skill of British infantry and the tenacity of Commonwealth troops from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India who fought alongside them. What comes through instead is a growing, almost reluctant recognition that the German position was slowly being out-organized, that information and support were reaching the British side faster and more reliably than they were reaching the German one, and that this gap, more than any single weapon or any single battle, was what was actually deciding the outcome. By early November, as the German and Italian line finally began to buckle under the weight of Operation Supercharge, the tone of these diaries shifts again, this time into something closer to grief. A supply officer, writing what would be one of his final entries before his own capture, described watching columns of vehicles retreating westward in a chaos that felt utterly unlike the disciplined advances of the previous year. He wrote that officers were shouting contradictory orders, that fuel was being siphoned from immobilized vehicles to keep others moving, that men who had marched confidently toward Cairo only months earlier were now marching back the other way with nothing to show for it but exhaustion and loss. Another soldier, a young infantryman barely out of his teens, wrote what might be the single most quietly devastating line found across these collected accounts, simply noting that he had stopped believing the retreat was temporary and that for the first time since arriving in Africa he found himself wondering whether the war itself could actually be lost. There is also, scattered through these pages, a striking amount of respect, sometimes grudging, sometimes surprisingly warm, for the ordinary British soldiers they had been fighting. Several diarists who were later taken prisoner wrote about their treatment with something close to relief, describing British captors who shared water, offered cigarettes, and in more than one case seemed almost sympathetic to men who had clearly been pushed to their physical and emotional limits. One captured NCO wrote that his guard, a young British corporal who could not have been older than 20, spoke to him not as a defeated enemy, but almost as one exhausted soldier speaking to another, both of them simply relieved that a particular stretch of fighting was finally over. It is a small human detail, easy to overlook amid the larger strategic story, but it recurs often enough across different diarists and different units that it clearly reflects something real about how many German soldiers experienced the aftermath of defeat, not simply as humiliation, but as an encounter with an enemy whose discipline extended even into how they treated the men they had just beaten. Reading through the wider body of German testimony from this battle, a clear and consistent picture emerges, one that goes well beyond individual moments of fear or exhaustion. Time and again, soldiers describe an enemy that seemed to know where they were, that could summon overwhelming firepower onto a single position within minutes, that coordinated infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support with a fluency that German forces, for all their earlier successes, increasingly struggled to match once their own supply lines and communications began to fray under sustained pressure. It was not a story of German soldiers being poor fighters, and their own diaries repeatedly resist that simple conclusion, full as they are of genuine bravery, professional skill, and dogged endurance under conditions that would break most people. It was instead a story about what happens when one side's ability to move information and support around the battlefield gradually outpaces the others until raw courage and tactical skill, however real, are no longer quite enough to hold back the tide. It is also worth understanding just how much the absence of familiar leadership weighed on these men during the critical opening days. Rommel himself, worn down by illness after months of relentless campaigning, had been convalescing in Europe when the British offensive began, and several diaries mention a distinct, almost superstitious anxiety that spread through the ranks in his absence. One veteran corporal, who had fought under Rommel since the earlier desert campaigns, wrote that the men trusted the general in a way they simply did not trust the officer temporarily left in command, and that news of Rommel's hurried return partway through the battle brought a brief, genuine surge of relief through units that had begun to feel abandoned. That relief, however, proved short-lived. Even Rommel's return could not solve the deeper problem plaguing German forces, the same problem that recurs endlessly through these diary pages a chronic shortage of fuel that made rapid, coordinated movement across the battlefield almost impossible, no matter how brilliant the plan on paper might have been. A tank commander recorded bitterly that his unit now had barely enough petrol to maneuver defensively, let alone mount the kind of sweeping counterattacks that had made Rommel's earlier reputation, and that watching British armour maneuver with what seemed like effortless freedom only made the contrast more painful to witness. The role of aircraft overhead adds another recurring and increasingly desperate theme to these accounts. By late 1942, Allied air power over the battlefield had grown to a point where German soldiers frequently described daylight movement as something close to suicidal. A supply driver, tasked with bringing forward much-needed ammunition, wrote that he had learned to judge the safety of a route not by the terrain but by the sound of engines overhead, and that even a brief, unexplained silence in the sky felt more unnerving than the roar of approaching aircraft, since it usually meant a strike was already inbound and simply too close to hear coming. Another soldier described watching a column of vehicles ahead of his own scatter and burn within moments after a flight of fighter bombers appeared, seemingly from nowhere, guided, he suspected correctly, by ground observers who had radioed their position only minutes before. This sense of being constantly watched from above, unable to move safely even far behind the front line, appears in diary after diary as a particular kind of exhausting, corrosive fear, quite different from the sudden shock of artillery, but no less damaging to morale over time. There are quieter moments, too, scattered among the larger battle narratives that reveal just how deeply personal this experience remained for the men writing it down. A medical orderly described spending an entire night moving between wounded men in a forward aid post that had lost its supply of morphine 2 days earlier, doing what little he could with bandages and quiet words while shells continued to fall nearby, and confessed that he had begun praying not for victory anymore, but simply for the shelling to stop long enough to move the worst cases to somewhere safer. A young lieutenant, writing what reads almost like a letter he never intended to send, described watching his men, boys really, some barely out of school, holding a position they all privately understood could not be held, and wrote that his greatest fear was no longer death itself, but having to write letters to the families of soldiers he had personally recruited into the army only a year before. These are not the words of propaganda, nor are they written with any awareness that strangers might read them decades later. They are the private, unguarded thoughts of men trying to process something that had genuinely broken their sense of how this war was supposed to go, and that raw honesty is precisely what makes them such a valuable historical record today. Even among more senior officers, whose diaries tend toward drier, more analytical language, the same underlying theme surfaces repeatedly once the narrative reaches early November. A battalion commander, reviewing the events of the battle in a private notebook rather than an official report, wrote an unusually candid assessment concluding that the German army in Africa had been defeated not by superior British courage, which he explicitly doubted, nor by superior individual equipment, which in several respects he considered roughly comparable, but by what he called, somewhat awkwardly translated, a superior system of cooperation between the different arms of the British force. He noted, with the kind of professional bluntness that only appears in writing, never meant for a superior's eyes, that German forces had spent years perfecting speed and aggression as their primary weapons, and had perhaps neglected the less glamorous but ultimately decisive work of building the communication networks, the logistics chains, and the combined arms coordination that had allowed the British, despite their earlier defeats and setbacks throughout the Desert Campaign, to finally assemble a force that could outthink as well as outfight them. By the time the retreat properly began, rolling westward across the same stretches of desert that had witnessed such confident advances only months before, many of these diaries simply trail off, their authors either captured, wounded, killed, or too exhausted to continue writing with any regularity. What they leave behind, though, is a remarkably candid and often deeply moving record, not of a single dramatic defeat, but of a slow, grinding realization, entry by entry, night by night, that the war in the desert had quietly and irreversibly turned. It turned not simply because the British brought more men or more guns to the fight, though in places they certainly did, but because they had built, over years of hard-learned lessons, a way of fighting together, of talking to each other, of moving information as fast as they moved men, that German forces at El Alamein, for all their skill and all their courage, could ultimately no longer keep pace with. And it is that quiet, almost reluctant admission, written not for propaganda or posterity, but simply to make sense of an unbearable few weeks, that gives these old diary pages a weight and an honesty that no official history could ever quite capture on its own. What makes these documents endure decades on is not simply their value as evidence for historians piecing together the mechanics of a famous battle, but the way they strip away the distance that time naturally places between us and events like these. Read enough of them together, and a pattern emerges that feels almost universal. The story of men who believed deeply in their own competence and their own cause, who were proud of their training and their equipment, and who found themselves slowly, painfully forced to accept that belief and pride alone could not overcome an enemy who had simply learned to fight as one connected whole rather than as a collection of brave individuals. There is no triumphant final entry in most of these diaries, no neat conclusion. Many simply stop, mid-sentence sometimes, the rest of the story lost to capture, wounding, or worse. What remains is a fragmented but remarkably consistent testimony, written in the middle of defeat by men who had no way of knowing how their private words would eventually be read, studied, and remembered by people on the very side that had beaten them.